They called it the perfect predator of armored warfare, sleek, deadly, and years ahead of its time. The German Panther tank, introduced in 1943, was supposed to redefine the battlefield. Even Allied officers who faced it admitted its brilliance, sloped armor inspired by the Soviet T-34, a high-velocity 75 km K-42 gun capable of piercing any enemy at over a kilometer, and optics so precise that its gunners could hit moving targets in a single shot. Yet after the war ended, when captured Panthers stood idle on testing grounds from Kubinka to Aberdeen, one military's verdict stood apart. The Soviet armor commanders, whose own designs had shaped the Panther's concept, looked at the machine they had unintentionally inspired and rejected it completely. Why? Why would the very army that had forced Germany to evolve its armor dismiss that evolution as a dead end? The answer lies not in battlefield myth, but in the unglamorous realities of strategy, logistics, and psychology. For the Red Army, perfection was never measured in precision. It was measured in endurance. When Soviet engineers at NII 48 and the GABTU Directorate examined captured Panther tanks after Kursk, they noted the obvious exceptional optics, superior gun stabilization, and crew ergonomics far beyond the T-34's cramped steel shell. But they also noted something else. The Panther's complexity bordered on self-destructive. Its Maybach HL230 P30 engine delivered 700 horsepower, but was notoriously unreliable when overheated or underfed with low-grade fuel. Its 45-ton weight crushed bridges built for 30-ton standards, and its double torsion suspension demanded precision manufacturing that wartime Germany could no longer sustain. Soviet officers saw not a weapon of war, but an engineering thesis, a masterpiece that could not survive the realities of mass production. Swan. By 1944, the Red Army's war philosophy had become brutally pragmatic. Soviet planners had learned through loss that the winner of modern war was not the army with the best tank, but the one that could field and repair thousands of them faster than the enemy could destroy them. The T-34 embodied that lesson. It was not elegant, it was inevitable. Each vehicle could be assembled in less than 2 days, repaired in field depots using parts from others, and maintained by crews who received minimal training. When the Soviets inspected a Panther transmission, they found it required specialized tools, calibrated torque, wrenches, and a workshop environment. That was fine for German depots, but unimaginable near the Dnieper River or the Vistula front. A tank that needed technicians instead of soldiers was to Soviet eyes already defeated. What made this rejection remarkable was that the Soviets could have copied it. They had done so before absorbing and improving foreign designs, the Christie suspension from the United States, the V2, diesel engine born from aircraft technology, the sloped armor inspired partly by early encounters with German and Finnish anti-tank fire. Yet after dissecting several captured Panthers, Soviet reports concluded not for adaptation, unsuitable for our operational concept. S2 Wolfend, they preferred to refine their own lineage, developing the T-44 and later the T-54, which emphasized reliability, simplified mechanics, and thick, easy-to-cast armor rather than finely milled precision. To Western analysts, this decision seemed almost ideological, a refusal to learn from a superior adversary. But to Soviet commanders who had seen half their armored divisions burned in the first 6 months of Operation Barbarossa, it was cold logic. The Panther represented a German obsession with tactical perfection, while the Soviet system demanded strategic inevitability. It was the same divergence that defined two wartime philosophies, Germany's craftsman ideal versus the Soviet industrial machine of war. When the Panther first entered combat near Kursk in July 1943, its debut was catastrophic. Of the 200 tanks deployed in Panzer Regiment 51 and 52, nearly half broke down before even reaching the front. Final drive failures, engine fires, fuel line leaks, each issue traceable to the strain of building a perfect machine under an imperfect war economy. Soviet observers noted these failures with clinical detachment. They understood what those breakdowns meant. The enemy was spending blood and steel on a tank that could win a battle but lose a war. Still, the Panther could kill. At Prokhorovka, a single company of Panthers destroyed over 30 T-34s before being flanked and overrun. Survivors described the shock of seeing shells bounce off its glacis plate like pebbles on ice. The Red Army respected that firepower. But respect is not adoption. To them, the Panther was proof that superiority and sustainability rarely coexist. In Kubinka, test drivers recorded that the Panther's steering was smooth and its gun control exquisite. Yet each kilometer of movement risked transmission failure, and each replacement part demanded hours of machining. When asked whether such a tank could serve in Soviet doctrine, fast, deep armored thrusts across vast terrain, Marshal Fedorenko reportedly shook his head. "Too beautiful," he said. "War is not for beauty." 3. The Panther's perfection, in other words, revealed its flaw. It belonged to a world where engineering triumphed over practicality. For the Soviets, that world had already died with the first snows outside Moscow. What mattered now was what could be built by exhausted men fueled by rationed diesel under artillery fire and still roll forward tomorrow. That realization shaped every Soviet decision from 1944 onward, and it explains why, even with full access to the Panther's secrets, they chose a different path entirely. The Soviet tank doctrine that emerged after Kursk was not a reaction to German superiority, it was a statement of survival. The Panther tank had shown what precision could do in short bursts of brilliance, but the T-34 had proven what simplicity could achieve across the chaos of entire fronts. The men who led Soviet armored forces, people like Marshal Pavel Rotmistrov, Mikhail Katakov, and Yakov Fedorenko, didn't see engineering as a competition of perfection. They saw it as the art of keeping an army alive when factories were under bombardment and railroads were burning. In the autumn of 1943, Soviet test crews at Kubinka proving ground ran comparative trials between captured Panthers Tigers and their own late model T-34-85. The results astonished Western observers. The T-34's 85mm gun struggled to penetrate the Panther's sloped frontal armor beyond 500 meters, while the Panther's high-velocity 75mm KBDK-42 easily punched through the Soviet tank from more than a kilometer away. On paper, the Panther was vastly superior. Yet when reliability was measured, the equation inverted. After only 100 kilometers of travel, half the Panthers broke down due to final drive issues or oil leaks. Soviet engineers noted that each breakdown required factory-level maintenance, a concept alien to their wartime doctrine. Tanks were meant to be repaired in the field by the crew themselves, often using parts stripped from destroyed vehicles or improvised with basic tools. The Panther, they concluded, was a work of art, but art has no place in a war of attrition. So, the Eastern Front strategy demanded something different. Soviet operational planning, shaped by Georgy Zhukov's emphasis on deep battle, required armored spearheads to drive hundreds of kilometers beyond initial breakthroughs, maintaining pressure without pause. Any tank that couldn't be fixed on the move was effectively a liability. The Panther's intricate suspension and overstrained drivetrain made it unsuited for such campaigns. German reports corroborated this during the advance toward Kiev. In late 1943, entire battalions of Panthers had to be abandoned simply because their transmissions failed in muddy terrain. To Soviet planners, this wasn't just a mechanical flaw, it was a strategic weakness. The Panther consumed more fuel, required more training, and needed skilled mechanics. Meanwhile, a T-34 could be taught, maintained, and operated by barely literate conscripts after 2 weeks of instruction. It wasn't about underestimating German technology. It was about understanding human capacity under war conditions. Documents from the Jab to Use 1944 evaluation make this painfully clear. In Design and Firepower, one report stated, "The German tank surpasses ours, but in the conditions of real combat, our vehicle surpasses theirs by survivability, simplicity, and repairability." S5. Those three words, survivability, simplicity, repairability, became the unspoken pillars of Soviet armored thought for the next 4 decades. The Soviet rejection of the Panther also came from another angle production reality. When the Panther entered service, Germany's armament industry was fragmenting. Precision components came from small specialized workshops. Heat treatment of armor plates varied between factories. Soviet industry, by contrast, had centralized and standardized production since 1942. One casting pattern, one engine type, one transmission used across thousands of units. That meant any damaged tank could be repaired with parts from another factory, even if they'd never been built for that specific hull. The Panther's tight tolerances made such improvisation impossible. When Soviet engineers measured the Panther's armor composition, they found it brittle at the edges, vulnerable to cracking from poor heat tempering. Even with advanced metallurgy, the rushed wartime process had introduced microscopic flaws. The T-34's steel was less refined, but more forgiving. It could flex without shattering a hidden advantage in brutal cold or uneven terrain. Then came the human factor. Soviet tank crews were expected to perform their own maintenance. Training manuals for the T-34 included instructions on how to replace a clutch plate using a log as a lever and a hammer fashioned from scrap. The Panther's manuals, by contrast, read like a technical textbook requiring diagnostic knowledge and specialized tools. The difference wasn't only mechanical, it was philosophical. The Red Army prepared for a world where every man was his own mechanic and every machine his own teacher. Even the psychology of command diverged. German panzer divisions concentrated elite crews in elite machines. The Soviets distributed competence building redundancy rather than hierarchy. In an assault, a Panther platoon might achieve a 1-to-5 kill ratio, but the Red Army knew that if one Panther was destroyed, a crew of 5 experts was gone with it. If a T-34 burned, another recruit could replace it tomorrow. This harsh calculus shaped not only the Soviet verdict on the Panther, but also their future vision of warfare. When they began developing the T-44 in 1944, it wasn't a copy, it was a response. Designers like Alexander Morozov took note of the Panther's internal layout, the central drive shaft and torsion bar suspension, but implemented them through simplified Soviet logic. The result was a tank with lower profile, better balance, and fewer moving parts. It sacrificed elegance for endurance, exactly the opposite of what the Panther represented. By the end of the war, Soviet commanders had learned to admire German precision without envying it. The Panther was an apex predator that starved when the ecosystem collapsed. The T-34 was the scavenger that survived anything. And when the dust settled over Berlin, it was the scavenger, not the predator, that had conquered Europe. But the story doesn't end there. The rejection of the Panther's perfection became a doctrine influencing everything from Cold War tank design to the psychology of how armies approach technology itself. In the next chapter, we'll see how that philosophy evolved, how the Soviet Union turned rejection into revolution, building machines that embodied not excellence, but endurance. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the Battle of Machines did not. The ruins of Germany became laboratories. Soviet teams from the GAB-TU and NII-48 were sent across occupied zones to catalog every fragment of the defeated Wehrmacht's technology tank factories. In Czechoslovakia, turret designs from Kassel and surviving blueprints from Emman and Augsburg. The Panther tank was at the top of their list. Not because they wanted to rebuild it, but because they needed to understand why it failed. At Kubinka, several intact Panthers were put through exhaustive testing. Soviet evaluators fired 85 millimeter, 100 millimeter, and 122 millimeter rounds into the glass's recorded armor spalling and measured ricochet angles with precision instruments. They noted the vehicle's superior gunnery optics, especially the Zeiss TZF 12A sight, unmatched by any Soviet system at the time. Yet, even as they admired its accuracy, they reached the same conclusion as before. This tank, the report reads, is suitable only for a high-level economy with large repair capacity and trained technical staff. It is incompatible with our conditions. S6. Those conditions meant something very specific. In the Soviet worldview, the next war, if it came, would not resemble World War II's drawn-out campaigns. It would be fast, nuclear, and total. Tanks had to survive not just bullets, but case itself, contaminated terrain, destroyed infrastructure, and mass conscription. The Panther's perfection, born from Germany's desperate quest for superiority, had no place in that vision. The Soviet Union would instead double down on simplicity, mechanical robustness that could endure an atomic battlefield. That decision guided the creation of the T-54, the most produced tank in history. Designed by Alexander Morozov in 1945 and refined through the late 1940s, it combined elements the Panther lacked: an easily cast hemispherical turret, thick armor sloped at efficient angles, and a rugged V-54 diesel engine derived from the War Team V2. Its 100 millimeter D10T gun could penetrate Panthers and Tigers at typical engagement ranges. Most importantly, it could be maintained by conscripts with minimal technical skill. When compared on paper, Western analysts sometimes found the T-54 crude. But the Soviets weren't building a dueling machine, they were building a system of war. Behind that design philosophy was a deep memory of logistical pain. During the early years of Barbarossa, Soviet units had lost thousands of tanks, not in battle, but to mechanical failure, fuel shortages, and lack of spare parts. That trauma embedded itself in every future design. The Panther reminded them of that nightmare, a weapon too fine to survive imperfection. So while Western engineers studied its gunnery systems for inspiration, Soviet designers studied its breakdowns. They charted which bearings seized under cold, which gears cracked, which fuel pumps leaked. Each flaw became a lesson, each failure a reason not to imitate. When American analysts at Aberdeen Proving Ground tested a captured Panther in 1946, they echoed many of the same findings: brilliant armor layout, excellent gun accuracy, but catastrophic reliability. Soviet intelligence intercepted those results and quietly archived them. The rejection was now validated by their former allies. Even the U.S. Army, in developing the M60 machine gun, or later armored systems like the M48 Patton, wrestled with the same trade-offs: complexity versus endurance power versus field reliability. For the Soviet command, this was proof that their approach was not primitive, but prophetic. They understood before anyone else that the future of war would belong to the weapon that could survive neglect. The Panther needed perfect fuel, perfect oil, perfect mechanics. The T-54 could run with dense cracks and half its systems disabled and still fight. There was, however, another layer: ideology. In Soviet culture, machines carried moral meaning. The Panther, with its precision-machined gears and elitist aura, symbolized the fascist obsession with hierarchy and craftsmanship. The T-34 and its successors symbolized the collective, anonymous, replaceable, but unstoppable. This contrast became part of the mythos that fueled Soviet propaganda. But behind the slogans was a hard truth: their tanks worked. Through the 1950s and 60s, that doctrine evolved into the T-55 and T-62, both inheriting the same mechanical DNA as the T-34. These tanks were exported worldwide from Egypt and Syria to Vietnam and Angola, forming the backbone of Soviet influence during the Cold War. Meanwhile, the Panther's design philosophy lived on elsewhere in NATO's Leopard 1, in the British Centurion, in the American M60. Each of those Western designs pursued firepower and precision, while the Soviet school pursued quantity, durability, and simplicity. This divergence created a strange balance of terror. In NATO exercises, planners worried about waves of Soviet armor rolling westward tanks that could be produced faster than they could be destroyed. The Panther's descendants were fewer but deadlier. The T-54's descendants were weaker individually, but immortal as a swarm. The ghost of the Panther haunted both sides of the Iron Curtain, a reminder of what happens when a weapon is too perfect for the world it fights in. The paradox was now complete. Germany had built the finest tank of the Second World War only for its perfection to expose the futility of perfection itself. The Soviet Union, by rejecting it, built an imperfect machine that would dominate half the planet for decades. But in the decades that followed, even Soviet engineers began to question whether simplicity had become its own kind of blindness. Could a philosophy built on survival adapt to the era of precision weapons, infrared targeting, and composite armor? By the 1970s, the Soviet armor doctrine, born from rejecting the Panther's perfection, began to face a new kind of battlefield, one where endurance alone was no longer enough. Wars in the Middle East revealed both the strength and the weakness of the Soviet design philosophy. In 1973, Egyptian and Syrian forces equipped with T-55s and T-62s stunned Israeli troops during the opening hours of the Yom Kippur War, destroying dozens of Western-built tanks with speed and coordination. Yet as the fighting continued, Israeli counterattacks, supported by advanced optics and precision gunnery, reversed the advantage. Soviet advisors took note. Reliability had carried their tanks across deserts and rivers, but precision was now deciding who lived and who died. S7. In the Cold War's armored standoff, this realization quietly reshaped Soviet thinking. The perfection they had once rejected began to return, but under a different name efficiency. When Soviet designers introduced the T-72, they sought to merge the simplicity of the T-54 with a new generation of fire control autoloaders and composite armor. It was a machine built not for beauty, but for balance. Even so, the philosophical scar left by the Panther remained. Soviet engineers were haunted by one fear, that they might build something too fragile, too elegant, too German. Every bolt, every component was measured against the memory of the Panther's failures. The transmissions that snapped in mud, the engines that died under stress, the perfection that couldn't survive reality. The paradox deepened in Afghanistan, where the T-55 and T-62 met a new enemy, not tanks, but mountains, dust, and ambushes. The same rugged simplicity that had triumphed at Kursk now became a lifeline. Soviet crews repaired their armor with scavenged parts and makeshift tools echoing their grandfathers on the Eastern Front. There, the Panther spirit was nowhere to be found, and that absence was survival. But the war also revealed the human cost of the Soviet system machines endured, but men broke. That the doctrine that prioritized mechanical reliability over human comfort left crews isolated, exhausted, and often forgotten. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed, thousands of T-54s, T-62s, and T-72s still stood ready, proof of an empire that had valued quantity and resilience above all else. And yet, in the irony of history, Western engineers studying those tanks found a kind of perfection in imperfection. The Panther had been a masterpiece that failed because it demanded too much of its makers. The Soviet tanks succeeded because they asked for less from industry, from crews, from the chaos of war. Today, when modern militaries design their armored fleets, from the Abrams to the Leopard 2, from the Armada to the M1A2 SEP, they carry a silent inheritance from both philosophies. Precision must now coexist with endurance. Perfection must be simple enough to survive imperfection. The ghosts of the Panther and the T-34 still face each other not on the battlefields of Europe, but in every blueprint that weighs efficiency against fragility, excellence against reality. In the end, the Soviets did not reject the Panther because it was German. They rejected it because it was human, bound by the same flaw that haunts every engineer, every general, every nation at war, the desire to create something flawless in a world that only rewards what can endure.